Betty Frieberg murdered and mutilated her husband. She confessed to her crime but was found not guilty. This is the case of the woman who got away with murder. Born Betty DeVore from a small county in the state of Iowa, she had a traumatic childhood. Her mother had various mental health issues and was often in and out of mental institutions. She frequently abused Betty, both physically and verbally. Betty once recalled how her mother threw a butcher's knife at her. Betty's father was also both mentally and physically abusive to Betty and her sister. When Betty was just 9 years old, a friend of the family SA'd Betty and her sister. Afterwards, he raised a hammer and said that if they ever told anyone about it, he would smash their head to a bloody pulp. As a young adult, Betty married and had 4 children. Her husband was nice, respectable, but the marriage ran its course and they became more like friends rather than lovers. So they divorced. By this point, 3 of their children had already grown up and left home, leaving just their youngest, Heather. Heather chose to live with her mother, Betty. A few years passed and Betty decided to attend a local singles night in the town. This is where she met 56-year-old Harold Frieberg. Harold had been divorced 4 times, had 6 children. He was a very tall, broad man. He was charming and owned a farm and basically swept Betty off her feet. After just 3 weeks of dating, they got married in 1988. So Betty and her daughter Heather moved in to Harold's farm. It was just the 3 of them that lived there, Harold, Betty and Heather, as Harold's 6 children had little to no contact with him. Betty and Heather would help out where they could around the farm. Betty also had a job selling life insurance. For the first few years of their marriage, it was bliss. They got on so well. Harold ended up adopting Heather as his own child. The only red flag there was that Harold would frequently complain about all of his ex-wives, saying that they were just after his money. He also said that none of his other children loved him. They never really visited him, spoke to him. They had no contact with their father. It was around this time that Harold suggested Betty sell him some life insurance, so she drew up 3 plans totaling around $250,000, with Betty being the beneficiary. In the winter of 1990, everything suddenly changed. Betty wasn't sure why, but Harold abruptly became very aggressive. He would physically and mentally abuse Betty and Heather. This regular abuse brought back traumatic events from Betty's childhood. Any kind of anger Harold felt, he would direct it towards Betty and occasionally his adopted daughter Heather. Also around the same time, 2 of Harold's ex-wives were suing him for unpaid alimony. One of his bulls died on the farm, and also cracks, like literal cracks, began appearing in the farmhouse walls. It's unlikely that the stress of these events caused Harold to become abusive, as we will see later, but the torment he put Betty through was horrific. He kicked Betty's foot whilst wearing his work boot, fracturing her toe. He would shake her violently if he believed the house wasn't clean enough. He would slap her across the face if the meals weren't made to his standard. He stripped her naked and rubbed foot powder into her vagina, yelling, "Maybe you can lose some weight from the inside." He would strangle her, smash her over the head. He stabbed her in the arm. He got 2 sides of an electrical cord charger, placed them either side of her head, and shocked her for up to 4 minutes. Whilst working on the farm, he randomly threw her off the combine harvester and began chasing her around the field, saying, "I'm going to chop you to pieces." On another occasion, whilst they were working, he threw her to the ground and poured farm chemicals onto her stomach, saying, "Maybe I can burn some fat off of you." This abuse would often happen in front of their daughter Heather, whom he would also abuse. He would slap her, whip her, tell us she was stupid if she did something wrong. The abuse got so bad that Heather had to start lying to her friends about where her bruises and scratches came from. It was so bad that neighbours half a mile away on another farm could often hear their screams. Betty went to the police many times. She tried to leave Harold, but he said that he would hunt them down and kill them. She was at her wit's end. She didn't know what to do. Betty was suffering and she just saw no way out. The only option she felt available to her was to take her own life. So one day she got a gun, pointed it to her head, but then Heather walked in, saw what was happening and started screaming, "How dare you leave me with this monster?" Frustrated, Betty turned the gun and shot it out of the window. All of this stress was causing Betty to have such extreme migraines that she often blacked out. September the 29th, 1991, Harold drags Betty out of bed and down the basement. He is demanding that Betty packs some boxes for him. He's due to go on a work trip. He's drunk, aggressive. Betty refused. It's early in the morning, she's tired, and she makes her way back up the basement stairs to go to bed. But before she could reach these stairs, Harold points a gun to her head. Betty freezes, looks at the workbench next to her and sees 2 pistols. She quickly grabs them, aims them towards Harold, shuts her eyes and fires 2 shots from each, so 4 in total. Harold mumbles, "Why did you do that?" When Betty reopens her eyes, she sees that all 4 shots have hit him. 1 in the neck, 2 in the chest and 1 in the back. He has collapsed onto the floor and is bleeding. Betty collapses next to her husband and just sobs. The next thing she remembers is waking in her own bed in the morning and thinking that perhaps it was just all a nightmare. She makes her way down to the basement, takes one look at her husband's lifeless body and realises very quickly that it wasn't. There's blood all over the basement floor, so Betty makes her way back upstairs, shuts the door, locks it, and gets on about her day. She takes her daughter to school, she goes to work, she comes home, her and Heather have dinner together, and then they go to bed. So she's just acting like nothing has happened. The next day, she takes Heather to school, and when she comes home, she makes her way down to the basement. She then spends the next 6 hours dismembering Harold's body. Using knives and an electric chainsaw, she starts with his genitals, chopping off his penis and testicles and placing them into a plastic bag. Psychiatrists would later state in court that Betty went into a dissociative state, that she began with the genitals due to the horrific rape she experienced as a child. This process, psychologists believe, was Betty's way of avenging a lifetime of abuse. Betty then cut off the arms and the legs. She stripped the muscle from the flesh and cut up the meat into smaller pieces. She then went on and removed the heart, liver and lungs. She retrieved her daughter's toy wagon and then placed all these smaller bits of meat and flesh into it. She then took a stroll around the farm and haphazardly just threw random bits of Harold's body everywhere, all around the estate. She put the larger pieces into the boot of her car, took a drive and then pulled over at random intervals and just threw them at the side of the road. After all of this, she went and picked her daughter up. They got their hair done, went for dinner and went to bed like nothing had happened. Over a week later, and Betty knows that she's going to have to report Harold missing. People are beginning to ask questions, so she reports him missing to police, saying that he went on a work trip and never came back. When police arrive at the farm, they immediately think something is awry. And when interviewing Betty, Heather walks in saying she tried to call her cats in, but when she went to find them, they were chewing on some rotting random meat. Police go out and search the property, and over the next 2 days find random parts of Harold Frieberg's body everywhere. They arrest Betty and bring her in for questioning. She immediately confesses to the crime and she says it was self-defense. She suffered a lifetime of abuse and it was either be killed or kill. Harold had a gun pointing to her and the only thing she could do was point one back at him. Police offer a plea bargain, but Betty turns that down. She knows that if she accepts it, she will get a life sentence. So 43-year-old Betty Frieberg is taken to trial and she is charged with murder. Now this is really important because all the defence have to prove was that in that moment when Harold is pointing a gun at her and Betty is pointing a gun at him, that she acted in self-defence. Because she wasn't charged with the disposal of a body, the mutilation of a corpse, or for concealing a crime when lying to police, all those charges weren't brought towards her. They therefore weren't relevant. So the fact that she spent 6 hours dismembering a body, 8 days concealing a crime, and then finally lying to police saying that he went on a work trip, all irrelevant because she's not charged with any of those crimes. She's only charged with the initial act of murder. Betty's lawyer as well, Tom Walter, is quite an eccentric chap. He also represented Harold in one of his divorce cases. He would bring a toy troll doll with bright pink hair into court as a good luck charm that he received from his daughter. He was 6'7", wore a cowboy hat, and was kind of charming in his kind of eccentric way. He brought all of Harold's ex-wives in to testify that they had also suffered from abuse. The prosecution objected to these witnesses, saying that it was irrelevant, but the jury got the general gist that this was an abusive man. So Harold has been painted as a monster, and with not much to go on, the prosecution argue that because Betty took out those life insurances, it was premeditated. However, someone that works at the insurance company said that Betty knew if she murdered Harold, she wouldn't benefit from those policies. Also, the first shot that hit Harold actually hit him in the back. Now, how could this have occurred if he was pointing a gun at Betty's head? Also, the gun in which Harold was meant to have been holding and threatening Betty with had none of his fingerprints on it. Not only that, it wasn't even loaded. The jury didn't really seem to care though about those kind of technicalities, and they found Betty not guilty. So she is a free woman. And I've read somewhere that she actually tours America giving seminars to law students. And as a joke, she finishes these seminars pretending to sell dismemberment insurance. So that was the case of Betty Frieberg. Let me know what you think in the comments below, whether she should have gotten away with it. From what I can see, there's not actually a lot of information on this case online. There was no podcasts or YouTube videos or articles. There was one blog post that didn't really seem legitimate on Reddit. The only source I could find was a book by Neale, and he is a true crime writer. I will put the link in the description below. It was only £4 for me off Kindle, and there's 12 cases in it. It was really interesting. He really researches every single case, and they're quite short. They're 10 pages long, but you get all the details, all the facts. And this is the only real kind of legitimate source I found on the Betty Frieberg case. Usually I take my information from lots of different places and then write it into my own story. But for this one, I only had one source. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe and comment, and I will see you in the next one.